February 25th, 1991. Kuwait, near the burning oil fields. Late afternoon. First Lieutenant John Marks eases his A-10 Thunderbolt II into a shallow turn over a battlefield that looks almost unreal. Below him, black columns of smoke twist up from oil wells and burning vehicles. The desert sky is dark, orange at the edges, as if the horizon itself is on fire. Beside him in the formation is Captain Eric Salomonsson, also in an A-10. They've already flown 2 missions today, hunting Iraqi armor threatening U.S. Marines on the ground. Now they're starting a third. Over the radio come calm, clipped calls from forward air controllers. More tanks, more armored vehicles, still moving, still dangerous. Marks will later remember this day clearly. 3 sorties. Oil fires raging all over Kuwait. The sky, he said, felt almost apocalyptic. On those 3 missions, he and Salomonsson destroy or damage 23 Iraqi tanks. An extraordinary tally for 2 aircraft in a single day, achieved under anti-aircraft fire over a collapsing army. Down below, the Iraqi tank crews have already endured more than a month of coalition air attacks. Now they face one of the most specialized and terrifying instruments of that air campaign, the A-10, with its huge 30mm cannon and the unmistakable growl of its engines descending out of the smoke. 2 decades earlier, back in offices and conference rooms in Washington, many of the U.S. Air Force's own leaders had privately dismissed this same aircraft as a mistake. Too slow, too ugly, too vulnerable, too focused on an unfashionable mission. One historian would later summarize the institutional attitude bluntly. The A-10 was the best deal the Air Force never wanted. Yet here, over Kuwait, in the last days of Operation Desert Storm, it is exactly the kind of airplane the men on the ground are begging for on the radio. And it is exactly the kind of airplane the men in those Iraqi tanks have learned to fear. This is the story of how an ungainly subsonic attack plane, the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, went from a program many in the U.S. Air Force quietly mocked to a battlefield presence that frightened armored formations and became beloved by the troops it protected. It is the story of how close air support, the unglamorous business of flying low and slow to help soldiers in trouble, clashed with institutional preferences for sleek fighters and strategic bombing, and how, for once, brutal practicalities and battlefield experience won. It is about engineers and reformers who insisted on survivability and simplicity when the fashion was speed and electronics, and about pilots who figured out that if you stopped trying to use the A-10 like a fighter and started using it like the flying gun it really was, it could change the balance of power on the ground. Above all, it is about the moment when an airplane many people laughed at, the ugly Warthog, stopped being a joke and became something else, the sound that made enemies dive for cover and made friendly troops say with genuine relief, "Thank God, the hog is here." The problem the Warthog was built to solve began in another war, in the 1960s, over Vietnam. U.S. forward air controllers and ground commanders learned the hard way that high-performance jets were often a poor fit for close air support. The Air Force could deliver enormous bomb loads, and did. But when small groups of American or South Vietnamese troops were in contact with the enemy, in the jungle, in bad weather, at short notice, supersonic fighters streaking past at high altitude were not always the answer. Instead, one of the most effective close support aircraft in Vietnam was a relic, the Douglas A-1. Sky Raider, a big, single-engine, propeller-driven plane introduced just after the Second World War. The SPAD, as pilots called it, could loiter for hours, carry a varied load of weapons, absorb damage, and work closely with ground forces. But it was slow and increasingly vulnerable in an environment filled with modern anti-aircraft guns and missiles. By the mid-1960s, the Air Force knew it needed a replacement that could bring the Skyraider's persistence and toughness into the jet age. There was another problem. The U.S. Army, frustrated with what it saw as inadequate Air Force support, was investing in its own attack helicopter, the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne. The Air Force feared, with some justification, that if the Army built its own potent close support platform, it might reopen inter-service battles over who should control fixed-wing and rotary-wing aviation. To head off that challenge, some officers in the Pentagon argued that the Air Force should field its own dedicated close air support aircraft, and do it quickly. One of the key figures was Colonel Avery Kay, an Air Force officer who had flown B-17s in World War II and later worked in the Pentagon's systems analysis community. Alongside Major General Richard Yudkin and a small group of like-minded analysts and officers, Kay pushed for what they called AX, Attack Experimental, a simple, robust aircraft, optimized not for speed or air-to-air combat, but for killing tanks and supporting troops on the ground. The proposal ran directly against the grain of Air Force thinking. The service's prestige and culture revolved around high-performance fighters and nuclear-capable bombers, not low-altitude mud-moving, yet the AX advocates had two very powerful arguments in their favor: recent battlefield experience in Vietnam and looming Soviet armored divisions in Europe. NATO planners in the late 1960s worried about long columns of Warsaw-packed tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap or other corridors in West Germany. Anti-tank missiles and artillery would help, but they would not be enough. What the alliance needed, some argued, was a new kind of specialized tank-killer aircraft, something that could survive in the dense air defenses expected over a European battlefield and still kill armored vehicles at close range. To develop this idea, Kay and his colleagues gathered operational histories, interviewed Vietnam A-1 and forward air controller pilots, and studied the survivability of aircraft under fire. One of the civilians involved in this process was Pierre Spray, a defense analyst associated with the fighter mafia led by John Boyd. Spray, who later exaggerated his own role in the project, nonetheless helped articulate a set of priorities that would shape the A-10: long loiter time, excellent visibility, the ability to maneuver at low altitude, extreme survivability, and weapons the very sight of which will turn an enemy soldier's bowels to water, as Robert Coram later summarized in his biography of Boyd. Coram also quoted another telling line about the program's status within the Air Force. The AX was a leprous project led by a pariah. Many senior officers wanted nothing to do with it, but the Army's Cheyenne program and the political pressure to improve close support kept the AX alive. In 1966-67, the Pentagon began to formalize requirements the new aircraft would have to operate from short, rough airstrips close to the front. It needed to be cheap enough to build in large numbers, easy to maintain with minimal equipment, and rugged enough to survive hits from 23mm anti-aircraft guns, the kind of weapon proliferating across the Soviet bloc. It also needed a primary weapon capable of killing a main battle tank. From that last requirement came one of the most distinctive design decisions in modern aviation. Instead of starting with an aircraft and then fitting a gun to it, the AX team started with a gun and built the airplane around it. The gun was the General Electric GAU-8/A Avenger, a 7-barrel, 30mm rotary cannon designed specifically to defeat Soviet armor. It fired 30 by 173mm shells, some of them armor-piercing, with depleted uranium cores, at up to 3,900 rounds per minute. In practical use, pilots usually fired shorter bursts, but the effect was still extraordinary. A tight stream of heavy projectiles capable of chewing through vehicles and bunkers. The gun installation in the A-10 would carry about 1,174 rounds. To accommodate the GAU-8, the AX airframe had to make a series of compromises that went against the sleek instincts of fighter designers. First, the aircraft would be relatively slow. The Kuwait's recoil force was immense. Firing it in long bursts at very high speed would be structurally and aerodynamically problematic. A straight high aspect ratio wing, optimized for low-altitude maneuverability, and short takeoff runs made far more sense than swept wings built for speed. Second, the airplane would be built not to avoid hits, but to survive them. The design included around 1,200 pounds, about 540 kilograms, of titanium armor around the cockpit and key control systems, the famous bathtub in which the pilot literally sat. This armor was tested to withstand 23mm cannon fire and fragments from larger shells. The aircraft's control systems would have double redundant hydraulics and, if those were shot out, a purely mechanical backup called manual reversion that let the pilot fly the aircraft by brute force through cables and pulleys. The airframe was designed to remain controllable, even if an engine, half the tail, or part of a wing were missing. Third, the engines would be mounted high on the fuselage, with the tail protecting them from direct fire from the ground, and with the air intakes well above the FOD-filled surfaces of forward, improvised airstrips. This unusual layout also helped reduce the engine's infrared signature from below. It was, in short, a design optimized for survivability and low-altitude performance, not for beauty. When the AX competition was announced in the early 1970s, two main prototypes emerged, the Northrop YA-9 and the Fairchild Republic YA-10. Both reflected the same CIS philosophy, but the YA-10's combination of wings, engines, and gun installation won out. On May 10th, 1972, the YA-10 made its first flight. After a series of fly-offs and evaluations, the Air Force selected it as the basis for the new close air support aircraft. It would be designated A-10, and somewhat confusingly, named Thunderbolt II in honor of the World War II P-47 Thunderbolt, another tough ground attack workhorse. The pilots and maintainers, however, took one look at the stubby nose, straight wings, and battle-scarred design ethos, and gave it another name, the Warthog, or simply the Hog. The nickname stuck, and in time, even became a badge of honor. The A-10's lineage also connected to an older Republic tradition. Previous Republic fighters had been nicknamed Hog, Super Hog, and Ultra Hog. The A-10 carried that unglamorous heritage forward. It was, from the start, an airplane that seemed to invite jokes, and then, under the right circumstances, make those jokes sound very short-sighted. In the early and mid-1970s, A-10 prototypes went through a demanding series of flight tests. Some of the most significant problems came not from enemy fire, but from the very gun that defined the aircraft. On March 11th, 1974, during testing at Edwards Air Force Base, an A-10 pilot fired a long burst from the GAU-8. The cannon's exhaust gases, dense, oxygen-poor, and extremely hot, formed a fireball in front of the aircraft. In a subsequent test that day, the gas disturbed the airflow into the engines, causing mild compressor stalls. Engineers realized they had what one contemporary account called a stubborn gun gas problem. The solution, after experimentation, was partly aerodynamic and partly procedural. Modifications helped disperse the gas, and the firing system was wired so that when the pilot squeezed the trigger to the first detent, the engine igniters automatically fired continuously, reducing the risk of flameouts. Test pilots later recalled that they were initially limited to very short gun bursts until the fixes were in place. By the late 1970s, the A-10 was entering service with frontline units in Europe and the United States. Its basic statistics were, on paper, unremarkable compared to contemporary fighters. It was subsonic, with a maximum speed of around 420 knots, about 480 miles per hour, or 770 kilometers per hour, at altitude. It sat low to the ground, with a wingspan of about 57 feet and a length in the same range, and could carry up to 16,000 pounds, 7,260 kilograms, of mixed ordnance on 11 pylons, bombs, rockets, AGM-65 Maverick missiles, cluster munitions, and, of course, thousands of 30mm rounds. But those numbers did not impress everyone. Many fighter pilots, accustomed to the sleek F-4 Phantom II and then the agile F-15 and emerging F-16, saw the A-10 as an ungainly, vulnerable throwback, a straight-wing aircraft in an age of supersonic, multi-role jets. It was, in their eyes, an airplane designed solely for a mission, close air support, that many in the Air Force still regarded as secondary, even distracting, compared to air superiority and deep strike. The historian Arden B. Dahl, in a detailed case study of the program, later titled his monograph, The Warthog, the Best Deal the Air Force Never Wanted. He described how, from the beginning, Air Force leadership tried to limit the A-10's numbers, questioned its survivability, and searched for ways to replace it with more conventional fighters. Robert Coram, summarizing the internal politics, emphasized just how unfashionable the AX project had been within the service's fighter culture. A leprous project, led by a pariah. In Europe, where A-10 units deployed as part of NATO's forward defense, some Allied officers initially doubted whether the slow tank buster would survive long against Warsaw-packed air defenses and fighters. Within the U.S. Air Force, as the 1980s progressed, advocates of multi-role fighters pushed the idea that a modified F-16, the so-called A-16, or other fast jets, could take over close support duties, rendering the A-10 redundant, even when the aircraft began to earn quiet respect in exercises for its ability to loiter, absorb punishment in mock engagements, and work closely with ground controllers. The jokes about its looks, its speed, and its supposed vulnerability did not go away. What kept the Warthog in the inventory was not affection at the top, but a combination of Cold War planning and congressional interest. NATO wanted a credible answer to Soviet army officers, and many in Congress liked the idea of a dedicated, survivable KS platform, so the Air Force continued to buy A-10s through the early 1980s. Ultimately, 716 would be built. Yet the real test, the one that would either validate or discredit the A-10's design philosophy, did not come over the forests of Germany. It came over the desert of Iraq and Kuwait. When Iraqi troops rolled into Kuwait on August 2, 1990, they set in motion a chain of events that would give the A-10 its first combat. Within months, a broad international coalition assembled in Saudi Arabia. The air campaign of Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, with a massive strike aimed at Iraqi air defenses, command centers, and infrastructure. Among the aircraft deployed were 132 A-10s. They were tasked with a variety of missions: close air support for ground forces, but also kill box patrols against Iraqi armor and artillery, armed reconnaissance, and eventually hunting elusive Scud missile launchers. The A-10s quickly began racking up sorties. Over the course of the war, they flew about 8,100 missions, an average of more than 60 per aircraft, and achieved a reported mission-capable rate of 95.7%, a striking figure given the harsh environment and the intensity of operations. They also launched around 90% of the AGM-65 Maverick missiles fired by the Air Force during the conflict. Early in the air campaign, many A-10 missions went deep into Kuwait and southern Iraq, often at relatively low altitudes, against Republican Guard units. Those missions were dangerous. Iraqi forces had concentrated anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles in key areas, and A-10s, by design, often operated closer to those guns than high-altitude strike aircraft. The Warthog's toughness quickly proved more than a marketing slogan. In several cases, aircraft returned to base with serious battle damage, holes punched through wings and fuselages, control surfaces shredded, tires pierced. Some were repaired and returned to action. Others were written off. But the pilots survived. 4 A-10s were shot down during the war, all by surface-to-air missiles. 2 more battle-damaged airframes were written off after crash landings. 11 others were hit by anti-aircraft artillery, but made it back. All of this underscored both the risk of flying low-altitude CAS in a modern air defense environment and the value of the A-10's survivability. The intensity of the threat led to a tactical shift. On February 15, 1991, after suffering several losses and heavy damage, A-10 operations were restricted to within 20 nautical miles, about 37 kilometers, of the Saudi and Kuwaiti borders, where the concentration of Iraqi air defenses was somewhat lower. Critics of the A-10 seized on those restrictions as proof that the aircraft was too vulnerable to operate deep over a modern battlefield. But by then, something else had happened. Something harder to dismiss. When employed correctly, with good intelligence and coordination, the A-10 was proving extremely effective at destroying Iraqi armor and artillery. Estimating kill totals is complicated. Some early post-war claims credited A-10s with destroying more than 900 Iraqi tanks, roughly 2,000 other military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces. Later analyses, including the U.S. Gulf War Air Power Survey and Government Accountability Office reviews, suggested that initial counts overstated the numbers of confirmed kills, and that attribution among aircraft types was often uncertain. Historians today generally treat the largest figures with caution. What is not in dispute, however, is that A-10s were among the coalition's most effective tank killers and flew a significant share of sorties against Iraqi ground forces. One event in particular showed what the Warthog could do when weather, tactics, and mission all aligned. The day John Marks and Eric Salomonsson killed or damaged 23 Iraqi tanks. On February 25, 1991, as the coalition ground offensive rolled into Kuwait, Marks and Salomonsson flew 3 A-10 missions in support of U.S. Marines. According to Marks's own later account, each sortie took them over a hellish landscape of burning oil wells and vehicles, with smoke turning daylight into something like dusk. Together, over those 3 sorties, the pair destroyed or damaged 23 Iraqi tanks. The sky was black from oil fires and smoke and burning targets, Marks recalled. It lent the missions, he said, an almost apocalyptic feel. An Air and Space Power Journal article, summarizing data from William Smallwood's book, Warthog, Flying the A-10 in the Gulf War, noted that during the ground offensive, a 2-ship formation of A-10s performing KAS destroyed 23 tanks and damaged another 10 over 3 sorties in a single day, often while under nearly continuous anti-aircraft artillery fire. This was not an isolated good news story. Across the theater, A-10s were flying kill box patrols where they were free to engage any identified Iraqi armor and artillery within assigned grid squares. Colonel William F. Andrews's study of CENTEF operations against the Republican Guard describes how initial attempts to use F-16 and B-52 for these missions met with limited success in some circumstances, prompting tactical innovations, including increased use of A-10s for deep attacks on armored columns. The A-10's strengths were now clear in practice, not just on paper. It could cruise at relatively low speeds, giving pilots more time to visually identify targets and avoid friendly forces. Its long loiter time meant it could orbit over a sector, ready to respond to calls from troops in contact. Its Cannon and Maverick missiles allowed precise engagement of individual vehicles, especially valuable in complex situations near friendly lines. Air Force leaders took notice. General Charles Horner, the Joint Force Air Component Commander for Desert Storm, later pointed to the overwhelming impact of air power on Iraqi morale. Based on interviews with some of the 88,000 Iraqi prisoners of war, he concluded that air's most significant impact on Iraqi fighting strength was the destruction of morale. General Merrill McPeak, then Air Force Chief of Staff, went so far as to say that Desert Storm may have been the first time in history that an army was defeated primarily by air power. The A-10 was only one part of that air armada. But in the minds of many Iraqi soldiers on the ground, it was the most personal part. Coalition psychological operations during the war emphasized the hopelessness of staying in exposed positions under constant air attack. Leaflets and broadcasts warned Iraqi troops that if they did not surrender, they would be destroyed from the air. For those in armored units, the repeated appearance of the same stub-winged attack aircraft, circling low and returning again and again, likely had a powerful psychological effect, even if we lack detailed individual Iraqi testimonies specifically citing the A-10 by name. What we do have are the aggregate accounts: Iraqi units, particularly conscripts, abandoning vehicles, digging in, or surrendering in large numbers after sustained air assault. For coalition ground troops, the perception was the mirror image. An A-10 overhead became a symbol of reassurance. In later years, soldiers and Marines routinely described the aircraft as a guardian angel, or in a now famous Business Insider headline, the face of salvation when you're outgunned in the U.S. Army. Within weeks of the A-10's first large-scale combat debut, the aircraft that many in the Air Force had seen as an ungainly anachronism had become, in the eyes of Iraqi tank crews and Allied infantry alike, one of the most consequential airplanes in the theater. The mockery had not entirely stopped, but its tone had changed. Desert Storm did more than validate the A-10's basic concept. It drove a rapid evolution in tactics and employment. Before the war, much A-10 training in Europe had focused on very low-altitude tactics designed to survive Warsaw-packed air defenses, popping up briefly to deliver weapons, then dropping to treetop level again. In Iraq and Kuwait, the density and nature of Iraqi guns and missiles, combined with the flat terrain and visibility, forced adjustments. The Gulf War Air Power Survey and subsequent doctrinal analyses describe how CENTAF, confronting heavy losses and battle damage from low-level runs, quickly moved many attack aircraft to medium-altitude tactics, including A-10s. Instead of screaming in at very low level, they would operate higher, then descend only as needed for weapons delivery, often relying on forward air controllers and targeting pods to find and mark targets. Pilots learned that the A-10 was not invulnerable, no aircraft is, but that its strengths could be amplified by careful planning. In daylight and clear weather, the Warthog excelled at visually sorting out enemy tanks from destroyed hulks, civilian traffic, and friendly units. At night, or in poor visibility, its advantages were less stark, and other platforms with better sensors sometimes took the lead. NATO and U.S. officers also learned that you could not treat the A-10 as a cheaper, slower substitute for an F-16. It was a specialized tool. Used as such, it was devastating. Used outside its envelope, it could be badly exposed. One result of this learning was a renewed appreciation for close air support as a system, not just a platform. The most effective A-10 missions in Desert Storm involved tight integration with ground controllers, disciplined use of kill boxes and restricted fire areas, good intelligence about enemy dispositions, and rapid feedback loops to adjust to Iraqi movements. After the war, Air Force studies on close air support and battlefield air interdiction cited the A-10's performance as evidence of the value of specialized CAS aircraft, and also as a lesson that tactics had to adapt quickly to real threat environments. The Warthog, in other words, was not a magic answer to close support, but it was a remarkably effective instrument when used by people who understood its peculiar strengths and weaknesses. Those strengths would be tested again in the Balkans and later over Afghanistan and Iraq. In 1999, during Operation Allied Force over Kosovo and Serbia, A-10s flew missions against Serbian armor, artillery, and ground forces, often in difficult weather and complex terrain. The unclassified Air University study, A-10S over Kosovo, by Christopher Haave and Phil Horn, describes how A-10 pilots improvised tactics to find and strike dispersed Serbian units, sometimes using their aircraft's durability to operate at lower altitudes than other jets could safely maintain under fire. They also performed forward air control, FACA missions, directing other aircraft onto targets. A-10s over Kosovo demonstrated again that in a contested environment with complex ground situations, an aircraft designed to loiter, take punishment, and work closely with ground forces had enduring value. In the decades after 9/11, A-10s deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, supporting coalition troops in sprawling counterinsurgency campaigns. Here, the enemy was not a mechanized army, but dispersed insurgent fighters, often close to civilians and friendly forces. Precision and restraint became paramount. The A-10 adapted, upgraded to the A-10C standard beginning in the mid-2000s. The aircraft received modern avionics, digital data links, and the ability to employ precision-guided munitions like JDAMS and newer versions of the Maverick. The cockpit, though still built around that titanium bathtub, now featured multifunction displays and HOTAS controls comparable to more modern fighters. Pilots used the Warthog's long endurance and ability to fly slowly to orbit over patrols and convoys, sometimes for hours. They could descend to very low altitude and fire short bursts of 30mm cannon within tens of meters of friendly forces when necessary, or they could deliver precision bombs from higher altitude when the tactical situation required it. Joint Terminal Attack Controllers often requested A-10s by type, precisely because the aircraft's flight characteristics and pilot training made them comfortable working at close quarters in complex terrain. The Warthog's survivability would again be dramatically demonstrated over Baghdad on April 7, 2003. On that day, during the initial invasion of Iraq, Captain Kim K.C. Campbell was flying an A-10A on a close air support mission over the city when her aircraft was hit by heavy ground fire. In her own later accounts, Campbell describes a sudden loud impact. The jet rolled left and pitched down. She found that she had lost all hydraulics and standard flight controls over a hostile city. With no desire to eject, she switched the aircraft into manual reversion. The A-10 responded, and she was able to climb away from Baghdad and nurse the damaged jet back to base in southern Iraq, flying on cables and pulleys alone for nearly an hour. When Campbell landed, ground crews found extensive damage, a large hole in the tail, significant structural damage, and systems shot out. The aircraft never flew again. Campbell received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and General Richard Myers, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later remarked that she was one of only a very few pilots ever to land an A-10 in manual reversion. Her story became a case study in both the aircraft's survivability and the skill required to exploit it. In Afghanistan, A-10 units would fly thousands of CAS sorties over more than a decade, responding to troops in contact in remote valleys, often at high altitude and in difficult weather. Over Iraq and Syria in the 2010s, A-10s again saw combat against the so-called Islamic State, destroying vehicles, fortifications, and small units, and sometimes escorting other aircraft. By this point, for ground troops, the sound of an A-10 overhead, the twin turbofan whine, and the ripping buzz of the GAU-8, often rendered in popular culture as Bra-T, had become one of the most distinctive and reassuring noises in modern warfare. The aircraft's psychological impact, in other words, had become as real as its ballistic one. From the beginning, pilots and maintainers gave the A-10 nicknames that acknowledged its looks and its personality. The Warthog, the Hog. As the years passed, other affectionate phrases emerged. One was, "Go ugly early," meaning call in the A-10 early in a fight, rather than as a last resort. The phrase has been widely associated with the aircraft in popular and professional circles, and is cited in various sources as a common saying among those who favor its capabilities for close air support. The plane also attracted nicknames from the outside: Tank Buster, Flying Gun. A Business Insider photo essay on the A-10 carried the headline, "This right here is the face of salvation when you're outgunned in the U.S. Army," capturing how many soldiers viewed it, not as a high-tech symbol, but as a blunt instrument that, when it arrived overhead, often meant they would live to fight another day. On the opposing side of the front lines, we do not have the same volume of memoirs or interviews specifically describing fear of the A-10 Iraqis, and later insurgents faced a variety of aircraft and artillery systems. But the broader evidence of demoralization under air attack is Stronghorner's observation about the 88,000 prisoners of war and the destruction of morale, cited earlier, captures the cumulative effect of repeated air attacks on Iraqi soldiers in 1991. Robert Coram's comment about weapons, the very sight of which will turn an enemy soldier's bowels to water, was, in context, a description of the design priorities behind the A-10's armament, not a quote from an Iraqi soldier. But for anyone watching footage of an A-10 firing its GAU-8 or standing within earshot of a live strafing run, the sentiment is easy to understand. The A-10's industrial and systemic story is less dramatic to watch, but just as important in explaining how an initially unloved aircraft became so influential. In raw production terms, the Warthog was modest compared to Cold War fighters. Between 1972 and 1984, Fairchild Republic built 716 A-10s. That is a fraction of the thousands of F-4s or MiG-21s built worldwide. But those 716 aircraft were relatively cheap to operate, designed for long service lives, and crucially, built for ease of maintenance in the field. Panels opened easily, systems were accessible without specialized equipment, and the rugged landing gear allowed operations from rough strips closer to the front. Over time, the Air Force invested significantly in upgrades and life extension. Beginning in 2007, Boeing and its partners undertook a major wing replacement program, the Thickskin Urgent Spares Kitting, TUSK effort, to fit new wings to many A-10s, allowing the fleet to remain structurally sound, potentially into the 2030s. The program ordered at least 173 replacement wing sets, with options for more, and by the mid-2000s, re-winged aircraft were flying operationally. The A-10C upgrade, adding modern avionics and precision weapon integration, represented another substantial investment, transforming the cockpit from 1970s steam gauges to a digital work environment. Training pipelines and doctrine also evolved. A-10 pilots accumulated thousands of hours of experience in live combat over 3 decades. Figures like John Marks, who by 2016 had logged more than 6,000 hours in the A-10, including around 950 combat hours, became institutional memory in human form, mentoring younger pilots and refining tactics. All of this occurred against an institutional backdrop that in many ways had not changed. The Air Force continued to prioritize multi-role fighters and stealthy strike aircraft, and to view specialized CAS platforms as luxuries in a budget-constrained environment. In the early 2000s, with sequestration and budget pressures mounting, Air Force leadership proposed retiring the entire A-10 fleet to save money for newer programs, particularly the F-35 Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, announcing the plan in 2014, said that retiring the A-10 would save about $3.5 billion over 5 years. Air Force Chief of Staff General Mark Welsh later cited potential savings of around $3.7 to $4.2 billion. Congress pushed back hard. Many members, influenced by testimony from soldiers, Marines, and A-10 pilots, and by the aircraft's performance in Iraq and Afghanistan, insisted that the Air Force had not demonstrated that the F-35 or other platforms could match the A-10's effectiveness in close air support. The Government Accountability Office, in a 2016 report, criticized aspects of the Air Force's cost estimates and analysis regarding the proposed retirement. In response to congressional direction, the Pentagon conducted a series of comparative tests between the A-10 and the F-35 in close support and related roles. A heavily redacted report, released under the Freedom of Information Act years later, did not show the F-35 as a clear-cut superior in KS, especially in low-intensity conflicts where stealth was less critical and persistent presence more important. For years, Congress effectively blocked wholesale A-10 retirement, even as the Air Force hinted at alternative CIS concepts involving turboprop light attack aircraft and drones. But by the early 2020s, as the F-35 matured and the Air Force's strategic focus shifted toward great power competition, particularly with China, the political resistance began to soften. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act allowed the Air Force to begin retiring some A-10s, and subsequent plans envision phasing out the fleet entirely by around 2028 to 2029, though congressional oversight remains intense and timelines could shift. Even here, at the end of its planned service life, the A-10 occupies a peculiar position. On one hand, many strategists argue that a slow, non-stealthy attack aircraft is poorly suited to contested airspace against advanced integrated air defenses. On the other hand, advocates note that much of the U.S. military's real combat over the past 40 years has taken place in exactly the kind of low to medium threat environments where the A-10 excels, and that no replacement has yet matched its unique blend of endurance, toughness, and pilot visibility at low altitude. What is not in doubt is that the enemies who once might have laughed at the A-10's ungainly shape learned, in multiple theaters, that when the hog appeared overhead, their odds of survival dropped sharply. Looking back, the A-10's journey from leprous project to legendary status illustrates several enduring truths about war, technology, and institutions. The first is that an ugly, specialized machine can outperform more elegant ones when it is designed ruthlessly around a real battlefield need. The A-10's straight wings, titanium bathtub, and giant gun were all the result of a design philosophy that prioritized survivability, loiter time, and lethality against armor over speed, multi-role flexibility, or appearance. That philosophy drew heavily on actual combat experience in Vietnam and hard analysis of likely European battlefields. The second is that institutional cultures often resist such designs, especially when they threaten cherished images of what a service exists to do. The Air Force prided itself on sleek fighters and strategic bombers. The A-10, as Dahl's title suggests, was the best deal the Air Force never wanted. It took budget politics, congressional intervention, and hard-won lessons in combat to keep it alive long enough to prove itself. The third is that technology alone is never enough. The A-10's impact depended on tactics, training, and systems. It took thoughtful commanders to shift tactics in Desert Storm when low-altitude runs proved too costly, skilled pilots to exploit manual reversion when hydraulics were shot out over Baghdad, patient JTACS to talk aircraft onto targets just meters from friendly positions in Afghan valleys, and logisticians and maintainers to keep aging airframes flying in harsh climates. Finally, the A-10 story underscores a tension that runs through modern military history between specialized tools that do one job extraordinarily well and flexible platforms that can be used for many missions but rarely match the specialist in its own domain. The Warthog is, almost by definition, the former. Whether the U.S. Air Force of the 2030s and beyond can replicate its practical effects with multi-role fighters, drones, and other systems remains an open question, one that will only really be answered in future conflicts. What we can say, looking back from our vantage point, is this: Those who mocked the Warthog either adapted their thinking, retired, or watched as the aircraft they had dismissed became a symbol of exactly the kind of practical, soldier-focused air power that wins battles on the ground. In the end, the A-10's legacy is not in how it looks, but in what it did and what it represented. The triumph, for a time, of brutal practicality over elegance, of battlefield need over institutional fashion, and of an aircraft designed not to impress an airshow crowd, but to circle over a muddy firefight until, at last, the men below could stand up, dust themselves off, and watch it climb away, still flying, still ugly, and still very much alive.